Good morning. Welcome to the First Unitarian Church of Salt Lake City. It is my pleasure to welcome each and every one of you here this morning, especially if you're visiting with us today. You are our honored guest, and we're so glad you're here. We invite you to stop by the welcome table just outside this door in Elliott Hall after worship. Let us introduce ourselves, and let us get to know you a little better as well. This morning, over coffee, I was reading the news headlines and came across a story that had something to do with Tulsi Gabbard shouting at Hillary Clinton on Twitter, and Hillary Clinton shouting back, and the Russian bots were shouting it at everybody. And I thought, this just sounds so noisy, right? It was a weird and confusing story, and it just made me think, as I often do these days, about how for all the spaces in our society to hear ourselves talk and to hear other people talk, there are so few spaces where we can just listen to one another. Places where we can open up a difficult conversation and come to it with an open heart that wants to learn and is willing to be changed by what we hear. And then I gave thanks that I would be in just such a space this morning with all of you. This morning we'll be hearing about a topic that is as tender as it is politically volatile and sorely lacking in things such as nuance and vulnerability. I can think of few other topics in our national discourse calling us to greater openness against greater odds and the topic of abortion. Though we are led to believe that there are exactly two positions on the topic, the truth is that there are as many angles as there are human lives affected by it. Few topics, therefore, call for greater trust in one another and in the values we share that inform our work. Let us then go forward through this hour, boldly trusting one another as we light our chalice with these words by the Reverend Erica Hewitt. With full hearts, we affirm our relationships with one another. We recognize our agency and our connective power, and we accept our responsibility to be bold and courageous. We light this chalice, symbol of all that we are, all that we have done together, and all that we will be, as our shared ministry encourages those within and beyond our walls. And now I invite you to rise in body or in spirit, and let's sing together number 303. In gratitude, we come together in trust. I ask the one next to me to hold the truth I've learned imperfectly and incompletely. And I ask to hold their truth gently and affirmingly. Together, we bring these gifts to the altar, approaching the complete truth that none of us can ever hope to hold. And we pray. Source of all truth, bless these incomplete and imperfect fragments of your name. For it is through our single experiences that we catch a glimpse of you. Remind us how limited is our view of the perfect truth. Remind us how much we need each other if we ever want to escape that limit. And remind us that when we aren't sure what the truth is, we're closer to it than we realize. All we need to do is turn to our neighbor and ask them to trust us with their story and promise to let that story change us. May it be so with us today. Blessed be.
Good morning. I'm going to make a little height adjustment. I'm not being nasty, just making a little. So we really are going to take on a major topic, big issue, and so we are going to be as inclusive as possible, and that is the name of this particular reading is when we talk about abortion, let's talk about men. There's actually a subheading which goes, since women don't have unwanted pregnancies without them. Anybody ever realized that before? I don't know. The authors, Michelle Oberman and David Ball, are both law professors at Santa Clara University. And they surely, I think, do a good job in kind of widening the perspective of all this. Abortion opponents won major victories when Louisiana lawmakers voted to ban abortions as early as 6 weeks into a woman's pregnancy, and the Supreme Court upheld an Indiana law requiring the burial of fetal remains in Box versus Planned Parenthood of Indiana and Kentucky, Inc. So what happens if Roe v. Wade falls? Abortions won't disappear. Nearly half of all pregnancies are unintended, of which 4 in 10 end in abortions. But it takes 2 to make an unwanted pregnancy. That's why we need to talk about men when we talk about abortions. The last time we included men in the discussion was 1992, when the Supreme Court wisely overturned Pennsylvania's law requiring a woman seeking an abortion to prove she had first notified her husband. That's right. Attempting to give men veto power over women was the only meaningful effort to include men in abortion regulation. Now, our entire abortion debate pits the fetus against the woman. Men are absent. Now, they can shrug off an unwanted pregnancy as someone else's problem, even though they contributed half the genetic material to the fetus. Most men probably won't think the abortion ban littering state houses has anything to do with them. Well, they're both wrong and right. It should be easy to apply these laws to men, to punish them in the ways we have long punished women. But we also know that's not going to happen. But nonetheless, just indulge us in this thought experiment for a moment. Alabama's abortion ban exempts women from criminal punishment, but if the Supreme Court allows the law to stand and all abortions become illegal, a man could easily be prosecuted. Here's how. Say John and Jane have gotten pregnant and they want to end the pregnancy. This is a common scenario, as ethics professor Katie Watson has found. Nearly 9 in 10 unwanted pregnancies happen in relationships, and most abortion patients say their male partners support their decision. If John buys abortion drugs online, or even encourages Jane to, then he could serve from 10 to 99 years in prison for aiding her. Now, this happened in 2014 to a Pennsylvania mother imprisoned for buying her teenage daughter abortion drugs. Now, things get worse for John when you consider that Alabama, along with other states that have passed embryonic heartbeat laws, grants parenthood to fetuses as early as 2 weeks after a missed period. If a fetus is a child, then John is a parent. John can't abandon his child and is legally obligated to protect it. Current law gives Jane the exclusive right to decide whether to end her pregnancy, but if abortion is a crime, John's obligations to the fetus may shift. If John walks away, knowing he got her pregnant and suspecting she will have an abortion, he may be committing child neglect. Or worse, mothers have been found guilty of murder for having failed to prevent their partners from fatally abusing their children. It's not clear what John is supposed to do, nor is it clear whether John can avoid liability. John may even have broken Alabama law before Jane got pregnant by failing to take precautions to avoid unwanted pregnancy. Like most states, Alabama law criminalizes recklessly engaging in, quote, conduct which creates a substantial risk of serious physical injury to another person. So when having sex without knowing whether she wanted a baby, he arguably showed a conscious disregard for the risks caused by pregnancy, whether from childbearing or abortion. Now, we know these prosecutions sound absurd. Indeed, we think they're a terrible idea. Prosecutions won't deter men from having unprotected sex, and the threat of any abortion-related prosecution already jeopardizes pregnant women's lives, which is why the American Medical Association, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and many states oppose prosecuting those who end their own pregnancies. Prosecuting men would intensify those risks. If John is angry or panicked about his own legal jeopardy, he may threaten or hurt Jane to force her not to abort. And surely the last thing we need is another way to fill the nation's prisons with men, especially, as so often happens, punitive laws are disproportionately enforced against low-income people and people of color. Now, maybe Alabama prosecutors will head to the white fraternities in Tuscaloosa and begin to arrest young men for conspiring to recklessly endanger the lives of the partygoers they hope to have unprotected sex with. But we doubt it. Think about it, though. The novelty of prosecuting men for abortion. Despite the sound legal footing of such charges, tells us something important about the way we have, until now, framed the debate. Boys will be boys, but women who get pregnant have behaved irresponsibly. We're so comfortable with regulating women's sexual behavior, but we're shocked by the idea of doing it to men. Though it might seem strange to talk about men and abortion, it's stranger not to, since women don't have unwanted pregnancies without them. All men, whether leaders, legislators, or just regular guys, should know that abortion is personal for them too. They shouldn't just speak to and about women. They must take responsibility for themselves. Both men and women are urged to buy tickets for the auction. The auction will be on November 2nd, and If you don't know this by now, it is the social highlight of the church year. And I don't know how the auction leaders do it, but this auction is yet again going to go over the top. For those of you who got to see Saturday's Voyeur, the woman who played Mary Poppins, the woman of quite a foul mouth, will be our auctioneer. And the Fairly Free Thinker Award will be given to Karen Shepard. And I don't know how many of you remember Karen Shepard. I do with tremendous fondness. She was a great legislator for us in Washington. And I see her from time to time, and she continues to be wonderful and gracious. And she's very happy to receive the Fairly Free Thinker Award because she is a fairly free thinker. So this is a great opportunity for us to help the church budget in a grand way and also have an absolutely wonderful time. The tickets are $75, but if the $75 presents some kind of a problem, do not worry about it one iota. Just talk to the people selling tickets, talk to me, whatever is easiest for you. We want everybody in this church community to attend the auction because it is a lot of fun and it's a wild place to get the church spirit really humming. So pick up your tickets right after the service if you would. Also want to make just a quick reminder that the book discussion series that I'm leading that pertain to African American novelists will continue this Thursday at 7 o'clock. It'll run about 7 to 9 o'clock in Elliott Hall. We're going to be tackling Beloved by Toni Morrison, which I truly believe is one of the greatest literary pieces I have ever read in my life. She has so much to offer in that book. The discussion can't help but be very, very rich and powerful. So we had about 35 or so for our last discussion when we did the Nickel Boys in September, Toni Morrison's Beloved. This Thursday, it's a big book. If you haven't tackled it yet, give it a quick read. Spend your Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday reading Beloved, and you should be able to make it. Also want to announce for those who are new or new-ish, Monica and I will be leading a UU orientation class on Tuesday night, November 5th, and you can register online, and it'll be held again in Elliott Hall, starting at 7 o'clock. It's a good opportunity to just learn a little bit more about Unitarian Universalist history, its theology, more about this church, and wonderful refreshments are served as well. So be sure to mark that if you want to learn more. And then finally, in addition to all these wonderful, the book of announcements that really reflects the vitality and the just the stretch of this church community. We're also a community that comes together in times of sadness to be there to support one another. And I just want to remind everybody that this afternoon at 3 o'clock, we're going to be holding a memorial service for Kathleen Powers, a woman who actually went to Sunday school here probably roughly 80 years or so ago, and she's just been a great and wonderful asset to this church. If you remember Kathleen and you want to drop by and offer your condolences to the family, please do so this afternoon at 3 o'clock. The offering will now gratefully be received, a chance to greet one another and bid each other a fine good morning. From all that dwell in the sky, let hymns of praise So last Tuesday night, during the interminable Democratic debates, the question was posed to the candidates, those running for the office of president, how they would handle the latest extreme anti-abortion measures that were passed in the state houses of Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Missouri. Now, these laws, quite frankly, are quite incredulous, offering that women can receive abortions, but only up until the time they know they're pregnant. Once they know they're pregnant, it's too late. And all procedures will be treated as heinous crimes with punishment of extraordinary measures, not only for the women, but for every doctor who was involved in the operation. Each of the candidates seized the opportunity to address in their own inimitable way that women and women alone have the absolute right to control their own bodies. And so abortion kind of fell into a political box. It's just a really highly charged political category with constitutional rights for women pitted against constitutional rights for the unborn. Every candidate, though, who addressed the issue of abortion vowed to codify Roe v. Wade. Now, obviously, abortion means a lot more than another constitutional fight. Understandably, terminating a potential life is a deeply personal matter. And furthermore, many moral influences weigh in on trying to determine just when does a life actually begin. There are so many stages of development. Does life begin with consciousness? Does it begin with a heartbeat? Does it begin upon independence? There's no single answer. But as long as old white men in legislatures everywhere assume the right to control women's bodies as dictated by their religious faith, well, we're going to have a political battle. None of the candidates, however, drew consequences. And it's so important to look at the consequences whenever weighing moral decisions. They never looked at the consequences that would follow these draconian measures to end a woman's right to control her own reproductive system. So these mostly elderly men argue that an embryo has personhood. And thus, as a person, they have rights guaranteed under the Constitution. Fetal personhood relies on the concept of what they call natural law, an unchanging moral principle that existed even before the Constitution was drafted. They firmly believe and try to argue that from the moment of conception, the fertilized egg is a person. And that person then has rights, whether or not the egg was fertilized by acts of rape or incest. This idea is not based in science, but in faith. And the holders of this faith want their beliefs to be infused in society with no exceptions. The new law cites that anyone, and I stress anyone, who violates the well-being of this person still in the womb, be it the mother or a physician, will face stiff prison sentences up to 99 years. These extreme measures will help realize the conservatives' dream of ending women's constitutional protection against being forced to carry a pregnancy and give birth against their will. Now, none of the candidates extrapolated what this law implies or how life will be lived when a zygote is given equal rights. Pregnant women would find their most personal decisions coming under state control. Now, here are a few of the concerns. Would a woman who chooses to smoke cigarettes or drink wine during pregnancy be charged with a crime? What if a judge rules or a police officer believes she is risking the life of her fetus by, say, mountain climbing or riding a roller coaster or even undertaking a humanitarian mission in a war zone? Who will decide whether a pregnant woman with cancer may undergo chemotherapy? Now, it might be tempting to dismiss these scenarios as a version of The Handmaid's Tale if it weren't already taking shape in states across the country. Now, Margaret Atwood's dystopian novel, The Handmaid's Tale, takes place in a theocracy called Gilead. There, women lead a lifestyle of total subjugation. Handmaids are forced to live as breeding concubines. Every month, each handmaid is ceremoniously raped by her commander, a man of high status, in the interest of rebuilding a population that has dwindled owing to secular immorality and environmental toxicity. Now, in an article just last month, in last month's New Yorker, Gia Tolentino reminded us that when Atwood's novel was released in 1985, reviewers at that time found her dystopia to be poetically rich, but implausible. Implausible. Today, in 2019, that book couldn't be more timely. Secular immorality has risen again as the basis of all society's troubles. And that was exactly the message that was delivered a week ago last Friday to the leaders of Notre Dame University, that speech delivered by our Attorney General, William Barr. In that speech, he was calling for nothing less than a Catholic theocracy. Barr lectured that secular ideas like moral relativism, these secular ideas were destroying the traditional moral order. Now, his tacit endorsement for theocracy, where religious moralism could take effect, accounted for his vision of Catholicism infiltrating all levels of government and reversing the trend in public schools which were becoming secularized. He urged his audience to fight back against who? Fight back against progressives. Progressives, whose influence through pop culture, entertainment, and the media was organizing the destruction of our country. I quote from Barr exactly. Progressives were organizing the destruction of our country. Moral relativism, claimed Barr, leads to drug use, mental illness, and violence. I didn't know that. Moral relativism. So obviously there are different moral methodologies, different moral strategies. Moral relativism, also called situational ethics, stands in contrast with what's called legalism. That's what Barr is representing. So you got situational ethics in contrast with legalism for pursuing moral decisions. Legalism maintains that morality can't afford to shift with the times. They argue that what is moral remains moral for all eternity. For after all, God doesn't change his mind about what's right or wrong. What God deemed to be moral, and I'm not exactly sure when that took place, cannot change according to circumstances. The correct moral behavior is absolute. It is absolutely absolute. So someone like Bill Barr approaches morality encumbered with a whole apparatus of rules and regulations that cannot bend. He gives directions to be followed in all situations because his faith informs him what is true in all situations. Solutions to moral issues are preset. You can look it up in a book. Now, generally, this absolutist approach to morality carries a punitive and even sadistic quality. It's more prone to hurt people than to help them. I mean, how else to explain, for example, homosexuals burning at the stake in the Middle Ages? Just an Old Testament rule, I guess, you know. That's the recipe. That's what you do for dealing with immoral behavior. And even until quite recently, you could find prison sentences for gay men that would last up to 60 years. Applying moral legalisms to issues of abortion is simply absurd. Why? Because morality fundamentally deals with human relations. Situational ethics puts people at the center of concerns, not old rule books. The legalist will always ask, what does the law say? The situationist will always ask, who is to be helped? Life is far too complicated to rely on absolute truths and methods. But even if the legalist is sorry that the law requires such drastic outcomes, he still claims, do the right even when the sky falls down. So he is the man Mark Twain called a good man in the worst sense of the word. What's missing is approaching morality through love. If human relations stand fast as our primary concern, we can't begin to tackle it without love, empathy, compassion. In the field of situational ethics, a person is fully aware of community standards and religious practices, but he or she is prepared to set those rules aside in a particular situation if love is better served by doing so. Rather than following an absolute norm, progressive or liberal or non-doctrinaire persons aim at a contextual appropriateness. They're worried not so much about what is right, but what fits. What fits here? Because circumstances alter cases. Circumstances are relevant, and they got to be taken into account. I mean, a famous example took place some years ago when a patient in a state mental hospital raped another patient. She was an unmarried girl, ill with a radical schizophrenic psychosis. The victim's father charged the hospital with culpable negligence and requested that an abortion be performed to end an unwanted pregnancy, to be performed at once in an early stage of the embryo. The hospital administration refused to do so on the grounds that the criminal law, here we go again, got to go by the books here, the criminal law forbids all abortions except therapeutic ones when the mother's life is at stake. This criminal law rested on a so-called moral law that holds any interference with an embryo after fertilization is murder, the taking of innocent life. So forget the circumstances in this particular situation. It's the law. Absolutism. A situational moral approach is needed in order to fit the many emotional circumstances that come into play. A morality that fits the situation is sought by the empirical, fact-finding, data-conscious, inquiring individual. Or as Gertrude Stein declared as she was dying, it's better to ask questions than to give answers, even good answers. William Barr does not ask questions. It would be so superfluous if you think you have all the good answers. Do not veer or swerve, or you will be labeled a progressive. But maybe smug religious moralists who have all the pretensions to truth and righteousness ought to consider that God may well have been a relativist himself. After all, in Isaiah 55, God says to man, "My thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways." God might as well have said, it's all relative, baby. It's all relative. And when you think about it, God does not apply the same rule to every situation. God just demands that we all love our neighbor as ourselves. You know, that's the rule. That's the rule that counts. Oh, the golden rule, whatever. Is to love your neighbor as yourself. Do unto others. Other interpretations of God just try to lessen people feeling squeamish or uncomfortable. It seems that sex makes a lot of religious moralists nervous. After all, the need for an abortion always begins with the act of sex. Advocating for legalism, absolutism, unwavering truth for all time is referred to sometimes as the immorality of morality. I mean, you miss the point entirely if it all really needs, I mean, if our understanding of morality is that it all comes down to relationships, then absolutism holds absolutely no place. When the religious right prepares to lock up doctors for performing an abortion, I can think of no greater immorality. And while trying to sort through one's own moral philosophy and the complicated issues of abortion, questions, not answers, are the stuff to help us through. Anything else must be considered immoral. So if I were on the platform as a Democratic candidate, I surely would have raised the question about the underlying attitudes towards sexuality, female sexuality, which the male religious moralist ostensibly knows so much about. Let me give you a little snapshot of history. Progressives and artists and radicals dominated New York City in the 1870s. What else is new, right? But these progressives always seemed at odds, back then, 1870s, with religious moralists who feel the need to draw boundaries around what is permissible behavior. And so a religious moralist at that time, Anthony Comstock, formed the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice. Well, maybe not that much has changed in the past 140 years. Comstock was a crusader for Christian values, as he put it, by attacking the sale of erotic literature, French postcards. Oh, some of you remember those French postcards. And arresting shopkeepers for selling the putrid stream of filthy productions of licentious minds. I quote him there. I wouldn't come up with a line like that. That was Comstock. So with all that said, his real target, what he's really after, were the women. He decided to take down Victoria Woodhull, who was running for president in 1872. She and her sister, Tennessee Claflin, opened the first woman-run brokerage on Wall Street. The sisters ran a weekly newspaper dedicated to women's suffrage, socialism, and free love. Woodhull, in fact, is credited for popularizing the term free love to describe sex outside the strictures of marriage. She says, an alternative to the domestic oppression of marriage. These women need to be stopped. I mean, come on. Now, although Comstock filed charges against Woodhull which did not stick, he became the darling of conservatives throughout the country who thought women's rights had simply gone too far. Woodhull, in fact, taught women how to prevent unwanted pregnancies. And she also taught tantric yoga. Let's be clear. Women in the 1870s had abortions. And as the historian Amy Werble wrote in her book, Lust on Trial, Comstock's abortion busts sometimes involved dragging women away from their doctors in the middle of a procedure. Writing in his ledger, Comstock noted the arrest of a, quote, very sick 17-year-old Barbara Voss, who was charged with wantonness and taken, still bleeding, to the police. So if men don't control women's reproductive health care that these moralists claim, women would go too far. Deeply religious men, filled with stern warnings about the negative impact of lust and sexuality, are actually trying to protect themselves from erotic feelings in the name of protecting society. Aroused by female sexuality, which doctrine insists is wrong and bad for you, so what happens? Men then need to control and contain women's bodies. Otherwise, the moral decadence stemming from sexuality will decay all of society. Mike Pence is the poster child for admitting the fright in being alone with women. Anything could happen. These wanton women could undermine his Christian values. These women could trigger stray thoughts away from mother. And so that way of thinking goes, better to avoid this altogether or keep women's bodies in check. We got to control it. Right now, in his home state of Indiana, state-run counseling sessions are required for all women seeking abortion. And the counseling is designed to dissuade women from going through with their intended abortion, offering so-called facts that differ widely from science. Now, I will always remember my first abortion counseling experience when I just began my ministry as a 26-year-old fresh out of seminary. Imagine this. My board president informed me that her 16-year-old daughter learned she was pregnant, and I was to counsel her to get an abortion. Well, I remained non-committal. After an extensive conversation with the young woman, she told me that she was fully determined to carry the pregnancy full term. She was ready to be a mother. She wanted to be a mother. And I said, okay, I will support you in every way I can. When her mother, the board president, found out, she was so angry with me for failing to accomplish her agenda, the mom's mission to end the pregnancy, that she resigned not only from the board, she resigned from the church. Oof. So about 9, maybe 10 months later, there was a knock on the parsonage door. It was the former board president standing there beaming with her grandson in her arms. I never saw a happier grandmother in my entire life. That's a pretty big boy you got there, I said. Seemed as though his jowls were hanging over his shoulders. I was just amazed. Yep, she said. We call him Moose. And after a short pause, she said, is it okay to come back to church? Well, I'm tough. I said, under one condition. You got to bring Moose with you. And all went well. I think we need to understand that our country is not nearly as divided on the abortion question as we are led to believe. Most everyone feels so much ambivalence. And we don't do well in this gray zone. And so religious moralists feeling, there's a void there, try to jump in and move the country to their side of absolute truths in moral issues. But the overwhelming majority of Americans maintain it has to be a woman's choice. Now, a woman may decide yes or no, but that decision cannot be left to men in government. It's in this grayness when all of us must consider love and compassion and empathy and all the myriad complex circumstances that surround each and every situation. And both sides need to remember to ask questions and show love, because this board president of mine, she was as firm and resolute and absolute in that her daughter had to have an abortion. That was it. And she too failed to understand the need for compassion. And also on the other side, we need to understand that biblical rules do not apply to everything in life. Because all of our lives are way too complicated for an absolute approach to morality. How terrifying to think that the decision is being ripped away from women themselves. It is essential that we do all we can to support a woman's reproductive rights. And we must shine light on the importance of relationships, take the circumstances into account with love, compassion. So be it. May we conclude our service, journeying our hymn books, please, to number 144. As we extinguish the chalice, may we enlarge our compassion and nurture our minds. May heart and mind unite and expand our ability to see the truth, to proclaim the truth, and to act upon it. Amen.